The final thing I want to talk about this week has to do with the federal budget. And even though I don't have you do any specific reading about the federal budget, I do like to look at some budget related documents, and we do like to talk about our nation's financial situation in this course. And of course, we do this because a lot of our politics is really about fighting over federal spending and taxation. So, this is really a critical concern for our political system. The federal budget has, of course, always been a concern, but it's especially come into focus in the last decade or so as our spending and income have gotten so far out of sync. We struggled with spending more than we took in for a lot of that 1980s and 90s. And then in 1997, a Republican-controlled Congress made a deal with the Democrat-controlled White House under Bill Clinton, and we ended up in 1997 with a a budget balanced budget agreement that by the late 1990s and around 2000 was generating a surplus of revenue for the government. But then we had a recession, and that was followed by tax cuts. Then we had 9/11 come along, then more tax cuts, and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and our deficits started going back up again. Then the Great Recession came along after 2008, and we really ramped up spending with lots of stimulus money and the bailouts, while at the same time our tax revenues had dropped off. And so our deficits went from 400 or 500 billion dollars a year to up well over $1 trillion a year. So right now we're living in a period where we're generating $1 trillion deficits, and it looks like we're gonna be dealing with them for several years to come. And a lot of people on both sides of the political aisle think this is really unsustainable, but we don't have a budget deal in sight that might bring spending and revenue into line again. So here's what our total federal spending looked like in budget year 2012, which started last October and will run through this September. We generally break our spending into three categories, and they're reflected here in this little table, although not necessarily well marked. The first category is what we call mandatory spending, and these are formula-based programs that individuals and states can qualify for. So, according to law, Congress has to allocate enough money to meet the needs of all the people or the states who qualify for these programs. The largest program, of course, is Social Security, but Medicare, which is health care for the elderly, and Medicaid, health care for the poor, have been growing very rapidly as well and have already collectively overtaken Social Security in terms of overall costs to the budget. The other mandatory category includes things like interest on the national debt, various welfare programs, unemployment payments, and so forth. Now, the next category is discretionary spending, but we split this into two subcategories. So one is defense spending, and this includes our vast budget for the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. And of course, here we're talking about soldiers and training and bases and weapons systems of all sort, plus our various wars and actions around the world, plus our spending on veterans benefits. So we're really behaving these days as the world's policeman, and we in the United States are spending what about the next 15 nations collectively spend on defense. So we're protecting not just ourselves, but really the world and stabilizing world markets, which of course has our own benefits us in the process. Now, the final category here is non-defense discretionary spending, and this includes everything else that the federal government does. So it includes Homeland Security, spending on education, roads and bridges, agriculture, whole host of other issues. But this amount only adds up to about $520 billion out of a $3.7 trillion budget. So I ask people who say, oh, we can cut $1 trillion, where is the money going to come from? You could cut all of the things that the government does outside of social welfare programs and defense and still have $1 trillion almost of budget deficit floating out there. Now, unfortunately, this $3.7 trillion budget that we've been spending only represents about $2.5 trillion in taxes and fees. So we end up borrowing about $1.7 trillion of this total. So that's our deficit for this particular year. The deficit is the difference between what we take in and what we spend in one year. Now, the amount that we borrow in all of our previous years of government action, that's the total debt for the nation. Now, this slide goes back to about the mid-1960s and shows how our spending and revenues have actually been pretty close to one another until the mid-1970s. And the deficits did increase from the mid-1980s onward, as I said earlier. You can see that the lines kind of get back together again in the late 90s, and then they actually crossed in the late 90s. And that was the period when we were bringing in more money than we were spending. But then we went back into deficit spending, and this has only gotten worse in the last few years as we have responded to our economic crises by hiking government spending and just borrowing more to meet our obligations. Now, this slide only goes through about 2010, but it shows how the mandatory spending part of the budget has been growing substantially. Even though discretionary spending has been growing in the last decade or so, although that's mostly because of defense expenditures, not because of expenditures on non-defense programs. Now, here's another interesting slide which breaks down our national spending on social welfare programs and defense as a percentage of our gross domestic product. So what you see here is that defense spending levels were significant in the late 1960s, and of course that was for the Vietnam War we were fighting at the time. Then those expenditures fell off as we pulled out of Vietnam, and then they fell again after the Cold War ended around 1990, but they've ticked back up some in recent years. But it's been the entitlement areas that have steadily increased over the decades, and that's fairly obvious from this particular slide. Now, remember that federal spending isn't the only government spending that's going on. The states and localities have been gradually increasing their part of the pie as well. Although keep in mind that they're responsible for a different set of things than the federal government's responsible for, and they don't have to be involved with national defense or large-scale entitlement spending. Still, the total amount of government spending has been increasing over time. As you can see, this slide shows inflation-adjusted spending at both the federal and then the state and local levels, and you can see that just sort of drifting up further and further. Now, where do the funds come from to pay for federal government spending? This slide shows the breakdown. It shows how about 43 or 44% of the total typically comes from individual income taxes, mostly on income. A similar chunk comes from Social Security and Medicare taxes, and these are, of course, levied on individuals and employers. If you've had any kind of job, you know you have to pay Social Security and Medicare taxes. Then another chunk comes from corporate taxes, and then there's an assortment of other taxes as well. But remember, the bulk of the money comes from individual income taxes and Social Security and Medicare taxes, which are kind of broken down separately on your pay statements. If we decide to raise taxes, these are the main categories we'll have to focus on. I mean, there just aren't many other areas out there that could be taxed, and that'll come into play when we try to figure out how to resolve our spending imbalances. Now, here's a slide that shows tax levels over time, especially on upper income people and capital gains taxes. We're in a period where we've got really historically low tax levels. Capital gains taxes, of course, are the profits someone makes when they sell stocks that have appreciated in value. So if we're looking for tax increases, these are the most likely areas for politicians to look at. But we do have to be careful, because if we raise these taxes on the wealthy and on capital gains, if we raise those taxes too much, then we'll create incentives for wealthy people to hide their profits or to put them in tax-protected activities that don't really contribute much to economic growth. Now, this slide shows the long-term projection, and I mean long-term, like over the last 100+ years, of our national debt. If our current pattern of spending continues the way it has been for the last several decades. You can see that by a few years after 2020, we'll pass the level of overall debt that we had at the end of World War II, and then we'll just keep heading upward. And of course, this really isn't a sustainable path, so some set of changes will have to be made to turn this around. As I said a little bit earlier, the vast majority of the growth of spending has come in association with increased healthcare costs, mainly for the elderly, but also for the poor. This slide shows how Social Security payments themselves aren't really slated to grow much as a percentage of our gross domestic product, but Medicare and Medicaid costs are projected to grow dramatically unless we can get the system turned around. So this last slide nicely summarizes our problem, namely healthcare spending. So the key to solving our budget problems will be, as a nation, figuring out how to provide decent healthcare services for a lot less than we're now spending. Now, unfortunately, to my mind, the President's signature healthcare reform law won't really make much of a dent in this problem, and in fact may exacerbate the healthcare spending difficulties we have. So this is going to be a long-term issue for us to resolve as a nation going forward.